Welcome, everybody. And David Bradley, our co-host. Good to see you here. This is our most interesting of all panels because it's a thing that's changing most in our lives, which is how the boom in new technologies and the innovations that we're facing impinge on our personal privacy and our personal liberties. I'm going to start with Jane Holl Lute, who, among the other things that was mentioned, helped found the Aspen Homeland Security Group in a nice restaurant in Washington. She took me out with Janet Napolitano, and we started a group to look at these very issues in Aspen. Tell me, Jane, the whole new cyber explosion, how has that affected the way you do Homeland Security?
I think running concurrent to the expansion of the internet, which is instantaneous and organic and growing by 100 connections a minute, is a global cyber awakening. All of us who are on the internet now are instantly connected to information we need, making data liquidity now something that is not only important and powerful, but in all of our hands. And this cyber awakening, I think, has three important implications. First, while we know a lot about people on the internet, we know a ton about them. We know people almost entirely as consumers, not as citizens. And governments interface with people as citizens, principally. Number two, the law, which is supposed to anticipate the familiar and guide us, is neither guide nor guardian in this environment. Mm-hmm. And third, governments have not really been in the game in cyberspace, largely because they're not the most powerful actors.
Right. Now, what happens is when you're at Homeland Security and you're worried about a particular pattern of activity, you can find, 1,000 times more information than you could have 50 years ago about a person. Give me some examples of how that works and why we should or should not worry about it.
I think a way to think about how it works is how we've been fighting terrorism over the past dozen years. The basic theory of the case has been that bad guys are out there trying to come here. And the way we need to prevent terrorism is to find them where they are and keep them where they are, fix them where they are, fix them abroad. And we've used intelligence, we've used the military, and we've used our international partnerships in NATO and with other governments. And the commingling of that to identify where they are and prevent them from coming. But what if they're here? What if there are already individuals inside the United States who affiliate with these ideas and mean others harm? Mm-hmm. How well will the intelligence community, our military, or our international partnerships work? We need a different model and a different approach to being able to say to the American public who have this expectation that your government is doing everything it can to keep you safe.
Let me take a very specific example, which is nowadays there are cameras all over Midtown Manhattan. In Boston, of course, there were cameras, perhaps quite luckily, near the end of the marathon. You now have new ways of using biometric optical scans so that you can tell faces, other devices that you can tell people's faces. Tell me how that works. Can you actually know where anybody of interest is at any moment? And do you have to have new rules of the road when you deal with that?
With technology, increasingly we can know where most people were at any moment, where they are.
Can you give me an example of you doing that once?
It's an example, I think, and the commissioner is here from Boston, about retracing steps based on the personal mobile devices that individuals had and calls that they made, and people can put them. That's actually been available for a relatively long period of time. Mm-hmm. And so using these devices and using them to fight crime and to forensically examine what happened and to build a case is an important component of law enforcement and policing in our communities. And as people understand the consequences of this sort of ever-present emission of knowledge and location, I think our rules, certainly our sensibilities are changing, and the rules will change with them.
But I mean, it feels a bit Big Brother-ish that at any given moment the government knows where I am.
Yeah, I think as one of my colleagues said, the more serious problem is little sister, not Big Brother. It's companies knowing, for example, and tattling on you about your purchase history. There's a famous story about literature coming into a person's home, a father getting very angry. Why was his young 13-year-old daughter getting pregnancy literature and pregnancy testing literature? And it turns out her browsing habits suggested she was pregnant, and she was.
Real quickly before we go on, a different type of question. There is now no Secretary of Homeland Security for the United States. Nobody has filled your job. There's no Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security. Washington seems totally dysfunctional. We can't even fill jobs in Washington now. Is that a problem?
It's a problem if the process is broken down, and the processes have in many ways in Washington broken down. It's not a problem because, in the particular case of Homeland Security, because there are experienced senior staff who are filling these positions on an acting basis. I come out of a military background. The leadership rotates all the time, and everyone is expected to be trained and ready to step into a leadership position. So in the instant case, it's not a problem. But to your broader question, I don't think anyone would accuse Washington of being a well-oiled machine at the moment.
And how are innovations, which is the subject of this conference, affecting our privacy?
And I will respond to that in just a moment, but I must respond to one thing. I think we have to very much worry about Big Brother, and it is not just a matter of companies engaging in this kind of intrusive activity, but the state. Surveillance by the state has never been greater and has never lacked as much transparency as we have recently learned as a result of the Snowden revelations. So let us not for a moment suggest that surveillance by the state is not a very serious matter. It is increasingly serious. And what it threatens is our freedom and our liberty. And the United States of America, I mean, the preamble to your Constitution is we the people. It's all about living a life that is free and freedom from surveillance. I'm not talking about not getting the bad guys. Everyone agrees we have to get the bad guys. I want that as much as you do. But we have to find a way of doing surveillance and law enforcement and counterterrorism and privacy, not to the exclusion of privacy. And that's something we've developed. It's called privacy by design, which is all about embedding privacy protective features and protections proactively into the design of information technologies, business practices, operational processes, working with the government to do this. And if you think that's a pipe dream, let me tell you, I was invited to speak at the Pentagon by the Department of Defense in March, precisely because they were attracted to the idea of privacy by design, privacy and surveillance, privacy and counterterrorism measures. They invited me back in August. We had a full-day session on how do you do privacy and counterterrorism. And there was a lot of interest in this, and we're working on this. So just let me put that on the table, that it is not, don't worry about the state. Worry about the state, and let's do something to ensure that our privacy, which is the underpinning of freedom, ladies and gentlemen, let's not forget. That's what people think. People think privacy is just a personal right, it's a fundamental human right, just a personal thing, but it's not this, it's the underpinning of freedom. It has enormous societal value. Sorry, innovation.
When you talked about in your papers that we read for this, you talk about it not being a trade-off. It's not either or.
Exactly.
You can have privacy and security by using new technologies. You just touched on it a moment ago. Explain how those new technologies work.
And what you can do, so we talk about abandoning the dated zero-sum model of it's one or the other, where you have what we consider unnecessary trade-offs. You abandon the trade-offs, you explore, and this is where innovation comes in. Privacy just is absolutely essential to innovation. Privacy is a necessary but not sufficient condition, but a necessary condition for innovation because it breeds new ideas and creativity. And how do you do this? So biometrics, for example, we've advanced something called biometric encryption, where you can get the value of the biometric that you need, be it facial recognition, fingerprints, voice, whatever you want, but it's encrypted so that the only way in which it can be accessed is for properly authorized uses, and that can be by law enforcement.
So in other words, if I walk through Grand Central, they're picking me up biometrically, that goes to law enforcement databases. It's encrypted, and if there's some reason they feel they might need to trace me, they would have to get a court order to do it.
Yes, because you need reasonable and probable grounds to access that kind of information by law enforcement. And we've done that with video surveillance cameras. You can code, encrypt the video stream such that only when it's properly required and judicially authorized is it accessed. We've done this in Toronto.
Jane, real quickly, and I'm going to get to you. Would that be totally fine with people in the Department of Homeland Security?
It's already in play in Homeland
Yeah,
Security. I mean, more people than there are on the planet have moved through TSA systems over the past 10 years.
Right.
More than 7 billion people. Data use, data acquisition is never its own point. You do it for an operational reason. There's never been a privacy breach in TSA. There's never been a privacy breach with that kind of information. So I guess I'm endorsing the notion that you can have privacy and security. These two things can travel together.
And you got a bit worked up. It may have been from a comment I made in the green room that I was going to ask the more philosophical question, which is, why is privacy such an important good? When I was growing up, and if I walked to the K&B drugstore in New Orleans and bought a pack of Marlboro, it would take maybe 7 to 10 minutes before both of my parents would know that. I had no privacy in that regard. And I think sometimes people confuse, or they say privacy, which is a word we all love, when what they really mean is anonymity. You get to do things anonymously in the society. For 2,000 to 3,000 years, we have not had anonymity. In other words, if I go do something in my town where I grew up, my community, people kind of know. And without anonymity, we tended to have to behave better than we do with anonymity. Do you feel that we need to preserve anonymity as we go about our lives?
Let me just respond to one thing before I answer that. You said in your small town, your parents and others knew. Absolutely. But what didn't happen was that information wasn't tracked in perpetuity forever. Right now, the ability to track information, your whereabouts, your mobility tracing is big. The ability to retain this information and potentially have it used in ways that you never contemplated, nor was it ever intended. That's one of the fundamental differences of hundreds of years before where we've enjoyed it. The reason we need privacy, it's such a basic concept to me, is privacy is like breathing. You take it for granted until you desperately need it and you need some air and you're being deprived of it. If you look at states that have morphed from free and democratic societies into totalitarian states, the first thread to unravel is privacy. The academics who have studied this point this out again and again, that without privacy, you cannot have freedom. And without freedom, because your ability, see, the opposite suggests that the state should know everything you do, and they have a right.
No, well, let's not go to the extreme opposite.
But that's where you morph into, because people.
Why would you have to morph that into
People often say, "Well, if you have nothing to hide, what's a big deal? You have nothing to fear." It's nonsense. The presumption there is that somehow the state or the departments of various businesses you engage in have every right to have access to all this information about you. And I'm not talking about information within your house, within your bedroom, but all of your activities that you engage in. And it's an absurd proposition. Privacy is about control, personal control, that the individual has the ability to control the information and the uses of that information.
Well, wait, should I be able to travel privately on an airline?
It's not about concealment. It's about your choice of how you use information about yourself.
If I travel on airlines, should that remain private?
I'm not saying that there aren't lots of places where you are required by law to give information, and you give it gladly, or you don't engage in that behavior. So if you fly, we're citizens, we all have taxes we have to pay to the government. The IRS, of course, is required by law to get that information. All acceptable, we know the rules. But those are legitimate uses of that information, and the protection of that information by those organizations, by DHS, by IRS, very tightly controlled.
What about buying a gun? Should I be able to do it privately?
We can get into the gun debate, but the point is there are laws, and the laws have to be followed. But the converse to that is that the government departments collecting that information are only permitted to use that information for a very narrow purpose, and they're not intended to use it for secondary purposes unrelated to that primary purpose of collection. It's very narrow. So privacy is about freedom and your ability to largely go about your activities as you wish, subject to limited exceptions, and subject, of course, to law enforcement.
I actually agree with you. I'm just asking these questions. But let me ask you, you say it's for limited purposes. Do you feel we're using that information for purposes for which it's not intended today, right now, say in Jane's department? Give me some examples.
I'm not going to comment about Jane's department. I don't know it personally. And
I
as
mean,
she
Homeland
said,
Security in general.
Homeland Security, I've worked with them. There's no issue. But I am going to point to the obvious, which are the NSA revelations that have been coming out. And not just NSA in my country, in Canada, the CSC, the same kind of thing. So that has revealed the massive scale of information about law-abiding citizens that are being collected. And let me point you, and if you want the reference, I'll tell you afterwards, excellent article on all the false positives. A false positive is you're identified as being a potential terrorist, and you're not. So it's a false hit. The enormity of the false positives that have resulted from these searches is just staggering and should be completely unacceptable to free and democratic societies such as ours. It is unacceptable because those people are not off the list. You know, there are these false positives, and until they are cleared, you can go through enormous problems and anxieties. It's outrageous.
Let me let Frank get in. Go ahead.
Well, I feel like a visitor from outer space here, because the crime story in New York is in two respects, I think, a distinction from the ordinary privacy and municipal problem story. In the first instance, it's as close to a solved problem that we thought was intractable as ever existed. The homicide rate in New York this year will be down 86% from the homicide rate in the same city with the same population and the same structural problems 30 years ago. Now that's astonishing. The second thing is that the changes that took place are relatively low tech, and they are all located, I might say, in public places. And this is going to be important when we center the conversation on privacy. The changes that took place were a computer being able to identify for the police force where crimes keep happening and where public drug markets are located. Now, that isn't rocket science, even circa 1975. It was a change in policing strategy, and it worked very well. Now, what about privacy? Well, in a funny sense, if you're talking about public places, you are talking about a serious problem, but I think privacy is the wrong word for it. The reason for that is that public places are too dangerous for a kind of untrammeled autonomy that we associate normally with privacy. So that, for instance, if you want to talk about 700,000 stops and frisks in 2011 or 2012, and about the fact that they keep happening to the same people in the same neighborhoods, and the false positive rate is hovering around 98%, as Anne has expressed it. You have a serious cost and a serious problem with serious benefits, and it's not about privacy. What it's about is government having to respect the dignity and autonomy of people in the streets, even though they know things about them that require a relationship between government and that person.
But how is technology and the new sort of command center we're going to see today change that?
It doesn't change that. That is a relationship between individual people. If machines could stop us and frisk us, and that does happen in the airport, folks who are going to travel, then in a funny sense, the indignity of the process or the power competition when two people with too much testosterone are on the sending and receiving ends of these stops and frisks doesn't happen. This is human relations writ large, and I think that as soon as what you have is a polite use of government, a polite use of technology, and some notion that the autonomy of the false positive, if everybody who is stopped and frisked is treated as if they were guilty, then you're going to be 99% wrong. On the other hand, I don't mind going through a machine if I'm one of 100,000 people who is coming to see the President of the United States, and there are people who are trying to make sure that none of those 100,000 are armed and dangerous.
Let me open it up, if I may. If we could turn the lights up a little bit so I can see. Raise your hands. Questions? Yeah, sure.
Respond to your innovation comment.
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead, Ann, and then this gentleman here. Wait, we're
I
going to
just-
let Ann give one quick comment, Ann. Yeah.
I never answered
Innovation.
the question about innovation, and I'll make this really fast. The reason privacy is so important to innovation is, and I say this as a psychologist, which I was in my former life, we all have limited cognitive bandwidth. By that I mean we all have a limited ability to focus on various things. If we are living in a society where we think we're constantly being surveyed, people are watching us. Let's fast forward this to 10 years on. Let's say everybody's watching us all the time. Imagine you lived in a I don't know, time of Nazi Germany, which is of course nonsense. But think if you lived in a society where you constantly were being surveyed and watched. What do people do? They engage in very self-protective behavior. They engage in attempting to shield their behavior, not because they're doing anything wrong, but because people don't like to be watched and surveyed. But the point is, what happens is the focus shifts away from creativity and innovation and risk-taking, which you need for innovative pursuits, because there's very limited amount of what you can focus on entirely. That notion of cognitive bandwidth is very important. So what we want to do is we want to encourage freedom and this notion of that you're not constantly under surveillance. One of your own professors here at Columbia, Professor Edmund Phelps, a leading economist. He recently had a book and he wrote about how important freedom was in order to develop innovation. And he was talking about how he was really worried that China wasn't going in that direction because their freedoms were restricted and innovation was coming to a halt. So that's just how I tie it to how privacy is an essential ingredient, not sufficient, of course, but essential to innovative pursuits.
I'm not going to sit here and listen to comparisons to Nazi Germany.
No, you're right.
She didn't mean it that way, yeah.
And you're absolutely right.
She pulled it back. We get a
No,
pullback.
I meant no disrespect at all. It's nothing like that. What I'm saying is when you look at countries like that and you look at what changed in those societies during a time of heightened surveillance, what changes is people alter their behavior. They automatically shield, almost instinctively, and what goes is innovation, creativity, and of course freedom.
I think what's happening right now, very powerfully, three norms are emerging, not only in this society, but globally. People have expectations of inclusivity, nothing about us without us. They have expectations of transparency, what's going on. And they have expectations of reciprocity. If it's good enough for you, or if you're making me do this, are you doing this as well? Point one, in response to that. So there are global movements, antidotes, and reactions to excesses that we see. The privacy community is not the only one outraged by some of these revelations.
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir. And identify yourself.
Charlie Hales, Mayor of Portland. We had an officer-involved shooting in Portland that was resolved because a young couple held one of these up over their windowsill and filmed it. A couple weeks later, I had the chance to try on the Google glasses, and I realized that if we gave a pair of those to each of our officers, as someone in this room might be able to do, they could always just say, start filming. I think this is the beginning of a very important discussion, because I think we in cities are going to have to figure this out. Anyone think the Federal Communications Commission is going to keep up with this pace of change? So
There is no FCC commissioner either, so we can add
so,
that to the list.
So we're going to have to figure out what the boundaries and protocols are for the use of this technology in public safety, because it's exploding very quickly. So I guess I'd be interested if any of the panelists have any thoughts about who the regulator might be, if not us at the municipal level, then whom?
Frank first.
Well, again, I think I can tell you how regulation is going to evolve, and that is that if the security device is useful, it will be tried at the municipal level, and if there are any norms that are going to be invoked to limit it, they will probably be in different levels. We're sitting here in a city where there is an ongoing conversation now between the police department, which innovates with security, and a federal court, which tries to protect when there are costs imposed. But the point that I think I'd want to make is that, first of all, cameras are so cheap now that in public places, if what you're concerned about is the right not to be filmed, game over.
Yeah.
We now are going to be living lives of record in public spaces.
Everything you do in public space will be on YouTube at some point if it's bad.
It can be on YouTube. Somebody's got to be interested in it before that.
No, that is
becomes
not.
a-
I've watched YouTube. That's not
Okay.
true.
Okay. You don't like cats, Mr.
Yes, correct.
Jacobson. Okay. Now look, the truth is that the issue which is going to be crystallized in public space isn't privacy in that world. It is dignity and autonomy. It is regulating the way in which power is used rather than removing the power. And that's going to involve balances, obviously, but it is not a technology issue so much as a human relations and a political issue.
Yeah,
so
I think
you ought
it-
to be comfortable with
Go
it.
ahead, Ann. Yeah.
If I can just say, I don't disagree with that, but I think it's both. It's human relations and technology. And if I could just respond to that question, I work with our police chief all the time in Toronto, Canada, Chief Bill Blair. We're very good friends. He actually has a slide he uses with his police officers saying that we have to take a positive-sum approach to policing and privacy, that you do both. That it, of course, there are cameras. We have video surveillance cameras. There are ways in which to do it that heighten the privacy protection, not to the exclusion of the cameras, of course, they're everywhere. But when it's done by the police, by the state, etc., you can weave in privacy protections in terms of the use.
Well, what happens when it's not? When it's everybody's walking around wearing Google Glass?
Google Glass is very interesting. I met with Google last month, and they are engaging in a number of measures. The big issue with Google Glass is it can record you and do all these things, but unlike a camera where the person being recorded has some notion that you're doing it, you don't have that notion with Google Glass. So they've already identified a certain light fixture that comes on when the recording
Yeah,
is
but
taking
you're already
place.
able to hack, so you don't get the red light on if you don't want it.
Sure, so it's like point counterpoint, but don't think that they're not aware of these issues, and they're actively trying to find measures to make Google Glass more visible and transparent in terms of their operations. Transparency is
But
key.
trust me, somebody will have a glass soon where it's not transparent.
Oh,
Even if it's not Google.
It's not that you can't up the ante, but the point is you have to reject the proposition that it is inherently a zero-sum game. You can have privacy and functionalities. We've demonstrated this in dozens of areas with all the major
Jane?
companies.
I would just say, we're talking about at some fundamental level security. And security is typically something societies assign to their governments to handle. We want safe streets, governments, you run the police. We want a safe country, governments, you run the military, you make the laws. And governments are used to being the monopolists in security space, and they are in all space except cyberspace.
Correct.
Governments have not been given the responsibility in cyberspace to keep us secure. So as we look at these trends in technology, on the one hand, we have an intelligence community that at some level thinks it's still 1947 and information's hard to get and the technology doesn't exist. But the most powerful companies in cyberspace have demonstrated that highly reliable, highly lucrative,
We're
important
running right out
information
of time. Let
is
me get
easy to
this
get.
one question
But you
in.
have to trust government.
Let me get this one question in.
Hi, Andrew Richet from Personal Democracy Media. I'm pretty sure if we asked the people in the audience here how many times they've actually read a terms of service all the way through before they clicked agree, we'd have a very small show of hands. We're addicted to these technologies, and we're obviously arguing today about the battle between Big Brother, or how Big Brother and Little Sister are using our data. What's the role that the public can play in this debate? What can we do ourselves to insist on a mode of behavior, not only by Big Brother and Little Sister, but among ourselves, to ensure that we can preserve the kinds of privacies and securities and freedoms that we expect?
We'll make a real quick wrap-up, so everybody gets to use that as their final answer.
Well, again, it seems to me that the question is about the use of power, and technology is a power, but it is used in human relationships. And so the politics of sorting through its solution is going to be a politics of individual dignity in power relations.
Jane?
I would say it's the accountability mechanism of this country that is in the hands of the people that is the most powerful mechanism of keeping their government honest and keeping each other honest as we evolve what is a very complex conversation.
You have to speak out. You have a strong voice. Speak out and let your politicians, let your governments know what you want. For the first time ever, 6 out of 10 Americans, ever since polling has been happening, 6 out of 10 Americans have rated privacy and civil liberties as being of greater importance to them than public safety and security. That has never happened before. So what you have to do is tell your governments that you expect transparency, openness on their part, and hold them accountable.
That's because 6 in 10 take security for granted.
Oh, no, I would challenge that completely. Privacy has traditionally been relegated to a lower category. And now, with all the revelations as to how much people don't know about what the government is doing, people are truly astounded, and they don't want that anymore, and they're fighting back. That's what I urge you to do.
And that sets up our next panel. But thank you, Anne. Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Frank.